The chains around Marcus Kane's wrists were built to hold a creature 3 times his size, yet he did not struggle against them. He knelt on the cold crystal floor of the Zyrath throne hall, surrounded by guards who stood nearly 8 feet tall, their pale blue skin catching the light from the massive glowing dome above. He did not look afraid. He simply watched. He counted the guards. He measured the distance to the doors. He noted which soldiers gripped their weapons too tightly, a sign of nerves, and which ones held theirs with practiced calm, a sign of real danger. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a hush spread through the room like a wave. Princess Seraphina Voss walked in, her long silver robe trailing behind her, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She was the heir to the Voss dominion, one of the most powerful ruling families across 100 conquered worlds, and she carried herself like someone who had never once been told no. She stopped a few feet from Marcus and studied him the way someone might study an insect pinned to a board. "So this is the great threat my father's fleet captured," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. A soft, hairless little creature, with no claws, no scales, and no armor. I expected something more impressive. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered nobles. Marcus said nothing. He kept his eyes forward, steady, calm, almost bored, and that unshaken stillness bothered her more than any show of fear would have. "Nothing to say?" she asked, tilting her head. "Humans are supposed to be talkative creatures, or is silence all your small brain can manage?" Still, he said nothing. A few of the younger nobles snickered, enjoying the show, but an older general standing near the throne did not laugh. His name was Draven, a broad-shouldered war veteran with deep scars across one side of his face, and he watched Marcus with narrowed eyes. There was something about the way the prisoner held himself, something too calm, too controlled, that struck a distant, uneasy memory in the back of his mind. He could not place it yet, but the feeling refused to fade. Seraphina circled the kneeling soldier slowly, her robe whispering against the floor. "Your ship was pathetic," she continued. "A small scout vessel, barely armed, easily overpowered. Your species must be truly desperate to send someone so unremarkable this deep into Dominion space." Marcus finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were a plain, ordinary brown, but there was something behind them that made her pause for half a second, something that did not match the fear she expected to see. "You captured a ship," he said quietly, his voice calm and even. "Not a mission." The hall fell silent. Seraphina blinked, caught off guard by the simple confidence in his tone. "Excuse me?" "Nothing," Marcus said, lowering his eyes again. "Just an observation." She did not like being confused, and she especially did not like being confused in front of her court. She straightened her shoulders and forced a light, mocking laugh, waving a hand toward the guards. "Take him to the lowest detention level," she ordered. "Let him sit in the dark and think about how small his species truly is." The guards lifted Marcus by the arms and marched him out of the hall. He did not resist, did not struggle, did not even glance back at the princess who had just humiliated him in front of dozens of witnesses. He walked with the same steady calm he had shown from the very beginning, and that unnerving calm followed him all the way down through the winding stone corridors beneath the palace. As the heavy detention door sealed shut behind him, sealing him into a small, dim cell lit by a single strip of pale light, Marcus finally allowed himself a slow breath. He sat down against the cold wall, closed his eyes, and began doing what he always did in moments like this. He started planning. Far above, in the throne hall, General Draven remained behind after the court had dispersed, staring at the empty space where the prisoner had knelt. Something about the encounter refused to leave him. He turned to a younger officer standing nearby. "Pull his capture report," he said quietly. "I want to know exactly where that ship was found, and I want to know it now." The officer hesitated. "Sir, it was just a routine scout vessel. Border Patrol caught it drifting near Sector 9. Draven's jaw tightened. Sector 9 was close, uncomfortably close, to a stretch of space the Dominion rarely spoke of anymore. A place where, years earlier, an entire war fleet had vanished into failure and silence. He did not say this out loud, not yet. But as he walked away from the throne hall, his steps were faster than usual, and his mind was already racing through memories he had spent years trying to forget. Down in the detention level, a young war medic named Alira Van was assigned to check on the new prisoner's vital signs, a standard procedure for any captive brought before the royal court. She entered the cell cautiously, scanning device in hand, expecting the human to react with fear or hostility. Instead, he simply extended his arm toward her without being asked, calm and cooperative, as though he had done this 100 times before in 100 different cells. As she ran the scanner over his skin, she noticed something odd. Faint scars, old and healed, ran along his forearm and shoulder in patterns she recognized from her medical training. Patterns typically caused by high-impact weapon fire, the kind used in large-scale ground campaigns, not petty border skirmishes. She glanced up at him, but his expression gave nothing away. "You have seen real combat," she said quietly, almost to herself. Marcus's eyes flicked toward her, and for the briefest moment, something shifted behind them, something tired, something old. "Everyone in a uniform has seen something," he said simply. Alira did not press further, but she made a mental note, and later that evening, while updating his medical file, she paused before typing her observations. She stared at the scars listed in his readout, then looked toward the small barred window at the top of her office, the one that faced the vast starlit sky above the Dominion capital. Somewhere out there, far beyond the palace walls, whispers were beginning to stir among the older soldiers stationed throughout the lower levels. Whispers about a name from an old, buried defeat, a name none of them wanted to say out loud, a name that belonged to a human commander responsible for one of the worst losses in Dominion military history. None of them yet realized that the very soldier attached to that whispered name was sitting quietly in a cell just a few floors beneath their boots, waiting, watching, and counting every second until the moment was right. Back in her private chambers, Princess Serafina sat by her window, still replaying the strange exchange from the throne hall. She told herself it meant nothing, that the prisoner's odd response was simply confusion or fear disguised as calm. Yet a small, nagging feeling refused to leave her, the same kind of feeling she got right before a storm rolled in over the capital, when the air grew still and heavy, and something in her chest whispered that everything was about to change. She dismissed the thought, or tried to, and turned her attention back to the reports on her desk, unaware that far below her feet, in a small dark cell lined with cold stone, the soldier she had mocked so easily was quietly studying the palace's layout in his mind, remembering every hallway, every guard rotation, every flicker of light he had seen on the way down. He was not thinking about escape, not yet. He was thinking about patience, about timing, and about the fact that every empire, no matter how mighty it believed itself to be, always had a weakness hiding somewhere beneath its polished walls. And somewhere in the depths of the Dominion's classified archives, a single old file, sealed and nearly forgotten, sat waiting to be opened. A file with his name on it. A file that would soon turn the princess's mockery into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. 3 days passed before General Draven finally received clearance to open the sealed archive he had been searching for. The request alone had taken longer than expected, routed through layers of bureaucracy designed to keep old failures buried, but his rank and years of service finally forced the doors open. He sat alone in a small records chamber, deep within the military wing of the palace, the air cool and still, the only sound the faint hum of the data terminal in front of him. He typed in the coordinates from the prisoner's capture report, Sector 9, and cross-referenced them with archived campaign files from 12 years earlier. For a long moment, nothing appeared. Then, slowly, a single classified folder blinked onto the screen, its access history showing it had not been opened in over a decade. Draven's hand hesitated over the console. He remembered Sector 9 well. He had been a younger officer then, stationed on the edge of what the Dominion called the Coalition Front, a stretch of contested space where human forces and Dominion fleets had clashed for control of several key trade routes. The campaign had started with confidence. Dominion ships outnumbered the enemy nearly 4-1. Victory had seemed certain. It had ended in disaster. He opened the file, and the images that appeared made his stomach tighten even after all these years. Burned wreckage stretched across kilometers of open space, Dominion warships torn apart with surgical precision, entire strike formations dismantled not through overwhelming force, but through calculated, relentless strategy. The report described an enemy commander who never engaged directly, who lured Dominion fleets into traps using minimal resources, who studied their patterns and turned their own strength against them again and again. At the bottom of the file, a single designation remained, redacted in most places but not all. A call sign, Kane. Draven sat back slowly, his breath shallow. He remembered now, the stories that spread quietly among surviving officers afterward, stories the royal family had ordered silenced to protect morale and the illusion of Dominion invincibility. Stories of a human commander who could not be predicted, who fought like he had already seen every possible outcome of the battle before it even began. He thought of the prisoner kneeling calmly in the throne hall, unshaken by threats, unmoved by mockery, watching everything with quiet, patient eyes. His hands felt suddenly cold. He needed to speak with the king. Meanwhile, deep in the detention level, Illyra Van found herself returning to check on the prisoner more often than her duties strictly required. She told herself it was simple medical diligence, monitoring an unfamiliar species for signs of illness or distress, but in truth, she was curious. Marcus Kane did not behave like any prisoner she had encountered before. He never begged, never threatened, never lashed out at the guards who sometimes taunted him through the bars. He simply waited, calm and unreadable, like a man who already knew how the story would end. On her third visit that week, she brought him a small ration of food, more out of quiet sympathy than obligation. He accepted it with a small nod of thanks, and for the first time, he spoke to her directly, without being asked a question first. "You're the only one down here who looks at me like a person," he said, instead of a specimen. Illyra paused, unsure how to respond. "You're different from what I expected," she admitted. "Most things are," Marcus replied simply, "once you actually take the time to look." She found herself lingering longer than she should have, asking careful questions about his homeworld, his life before the war, small things meant to pass the time. He answered some, deflected others, but there was no anger in his voice, only a tired kind of patience, as though he had explained pieces of himself to strangers many times before, always knowing it might be the last conversation he ever had. Word of Draven's discovery spread quietly through the upper ranks of the military, carefully at first, whispered between officers who remembered the old campaign and had spent years pretending it never happened. Some dismissed it as coincidence, insisting the Kane from the old reports could not possibly be the same soft-spoken prisoner captured near a routine patrol route. Others, especially those who had personally survived the Coalition front disaster, grew pale at the mere mention of the name, refusing to discuss it further. Draven requested an audience with King Aldrin Voss, Seraphina's father, a broad, imposing ruler whose reputation for strength had kept the Dominion's many conquered worlds obedient for decades. The king listened in stony silence as Draven laid out the evidence, the old campaign files, the matching scars documented in the prisoner's medical scan, the eerie calm that so closely matched survivor accounts of the elusive human commander who had humiliated Dominion forces years earlier. When Draven finished, the king said nothing for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly against the arm of his chair. "You are telling me," he finally said, his voice low and controlled, "that my daughter mocked this man in front of the entire court, unaware that he was responsible for one of the worst defeats in this Dominion's history." "Yes, Your Majesty," Draven replied carefully. The king's expression darkened, though whether from anger, concern, or something closer to fear, Draven could not tell. "Does she know?" "Not yet." The king rose from his seat, walking slowly toward the tall window overlooking the capital city, its glittering towers stretching endlessly beneath a violet evening sky. "Then she needs to," he said quietly, "before this becomes something none of us can control." That evening, Seraphina was summoned to her father's private study, a room she rarely visited unless something serious required her attention. She arrived expecting a lecture about court etiquette or diplomatic protocol, something she could easily brush aside. Instead, she found her father standing beside General Draven, both wearing expressions she had never seen on either of them before, expressions of genuine unease. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, folding her arms. Her father gestured toward a small holographic display on his desk. "Sit down, Seraphina. There is something you need to understand about the prisoner you humiliated in the throne hall." She frowned. confusion flickering across her face as Draven activated the display. Images began to appear, the same burned wreckage from the old campaign files, the same devastating reports of an unstoppable human commander who had shattered entire Dominion fleets through patience and precision, rather than brute strength. She watched in growing disbelief as her father explained, in slow, careful detail, exactly who Marcus Kane truly was. By the time he finished, the color had drained from her face. She thought back to the throne hall, to her own mocking words, to the way she had laughed at his lack of claws and armor, calling him soft and unremarkable in front of her entire court. She remembered the strange calm in his eyes when he corrected her, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said she had captured a ship, not a mission. He had known exactly what she did not. "That's impossible," she said quietly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. The pieces fit together too perfectly, the scars, the composure, the eerie stillness that had unsettled even her father's most experienced generals. He looked so ordinary. "So did every legend before people understood what they were looking at," Draven said quietly. Seraphina sat in stunned silence, her mind racing back through every mocking word she had spoken, every laugh she had allowed her court to share at his expense. A cold, uncomfortable feeling settled in her chest, something close to shame, though she was not yet ready to name it. "What do we do with him now?" she finally asked. Her father's expression turned grim. "That," he said slowly, "depends entirely on what he chooses to do with us." Outside the palace walls, far beyond the reach of Dominion sensors, a small fleet of unfamiliar ships had begun quietly gathering near the outer edge of Zyrath space, their engines powered down to avoid detection, their commanders waiting patiently for a single signal that had not yet come. None of the Dominion scouts had noticed them yet. None of the guards patrolling the palace corridors understood how close the walls around them truly were to being tested. And deep within the lowest detention level, Marcus Kane sat quietly in his cell, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady, as though some distant part of him could already feel the shift in the air above, the quiet, gathering tension of a storm about to break. Seraphina did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her chambers, staring at the domed ceiling above her bed, replaying the throne hall scene over and over in her mind. Every mocking word she had spoken now felt like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking slowly, pulling something heavy down with it. She had built her entire reputation on being sharp, clever, always in control, yet the one time she had truly needed to understand who stood before her, she had seen nothing but a quiet, ordinary man kneeling in chains. By morning, she had made a decision. She would go to the detention level herself, not to mock him again, but to see the truth with her own eyes. She dressed quickly, ignoring the questions from her attendants, and made her way down through the winding stone corridors toward the lowest level of the palace, the same path the guards had taken days earlier when they dragged Marcus away from her laughter. The guards at the detention entrance straightened immediately when they saw her approach. "Princess," one of them said, clearly surprised. "Is something wrong?" "I need to speak with the prisoner," she said. "Alone." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "Your Highness, given what we now know about him, is that wise?" "I am not asking for your opinion," she said, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "Open the cell." They obeyed, though reluctantly, and Seraphina stepped into the narrow corridor leading toward Marcus Kane's cell, her footsteps echoing against the stone. She found him sitting exactly as he had been for days, back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slow and even, as though the weight of his situation meant nothing to him at all. He opened his eyes as she approached, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. She had expected to see something different in his face, now that she knew the truth, some hidden fierceness, some dangerous edge she had missed before. Instead, she saw only quiet tiredness, and something that almost looked like understanding. "Come to mock me again?" he asked, though there was no real bitterness in his voice. "No," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I came because I was wrong." Something shifted in his expression, subtle, but real. "Wrong about what?" "About you," she admitted, stepping closer to the bars separating them. "I know who you are now. I know what happened at the coalition front. I know why my generals go pale when they hear your name." She paused, forcing herself to hold his gaze, despite the discomfort curling in her chest. I mocked a man who dismantled Dominion fleets my father's empire has never fully recovered from, and I did it without knowing a single thing about him. Marcus studied her carefully, as though trying to determine whether her honesty was genuine or simply another tactic. Most people, once they learn something like that, don't come down here to admit it, he said. They usually just decide it's safer to have me removed. Some of my father's council believe that would be the wiser choice, she said quietly. I haven't decided what I believe yet. That's more honest than most royalty manage, Marcus replied, a faint, tired hint of amusement touching his voice for the first time. Serafina sat down slowly on the cold floor outside his cell, an act so unbecoming of her title that she almost couldn't believe she was doing it herself. Tell me what actually happened, she said. Not the version buried in classified files. What really happened out there? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at some distant point beyond the stone walls surrounding them, as though looking through time itself. We were outnumbered, he finally said. Badly. 4 Dominion ships for every one of ours. Most of my command staff wanted to retreat before the fighting even started. I convinced them to stay. Why? Because retreating would have meant losing everything behind us, not just that battle, he said. So instead, we studied your fleet's patterns. Dominion commanders are trained to overwhelm through numbers, to trust strength over patience. That predictability became your weakness. We didn't need to be stronger. We only needed to understand you better than you understood yourselves. Serafina listened, her earlier assumptions crumbling with every word. She had grown up believing Dominion military doctrine was unbeatable, that overwhelming force always guaranteed victory. Hearing him describe, so calmly, how patience and understanding had dismantled that very belief, left her unsettled in a way she hadn't expected. You could have destroyed us completely that day, she said slowly. Reports say you had the opportunity to press further into Dominion territory after the battle. Why didn't you? Marcus's expression grew distant again, quieter this time. Because winning a battle and winning a war are not the same thing, he said. Pushing further would have meant more lives lost, on both sides, for territory we didn't actually need. I made the call to hold our position instead. Some of my superiors weren't happy about that decision. Is that why you were reassigned to a scout mission instead of commanding another fleet? She asked, remembering fragments from the classified files Draven had shown her father. Something flickered behind his eyes, brief but unmistakable. Something like that, he said, his voice suddenly guarded. Serafina noticed the shift immediately, the subtle retreat behind his calm exterior, and she found herself surprisingly reluctant to push further. Instead, she sat in silence with him for a long moment, the quiet stretching comfortably between them, in a way she hadn't expected from a conversation with a prisoner she had mocked only days earlier. I misjudged you, she finally said. Not just your military record. I misjudged what kind of person you are. Marcus studied her carefully, weighing her words. Most people don't bother coming back to correct that kind of mistake, he said. Why did you? Serafina considered the question honestly before answering. Because pretending I was right would have been easier, she admitted, and I'm tired of easy answers that turn out to be wrong. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor. General Draven appeared at the entrance to the detention level, his expression tense and urgent. Your Highness, he said quickly, you need to come with me immediately. Serafina rose to her feet, glancing back at Marcus one last time before following the general out of the detention level. What's happening? She asked, as they climbed the stairs toward the upper palace. Long-range sensors picked up unfamiliar ship signatures near the outer edge of our territory, Draven said, his voice low and controlled, despite the clear tension beneath it. Small fleet, engines powered low, clearly trying to avoid detection. We believe they may be searching for something, or someone. Serafina's stomach tightened as the pieces fell into place. You think they're here for him? It's the only explanation that makes sense, Draven said. If Kane commanded forces significant enough to shatter our fleets at the coalition front, it stands to reason his people wouldn't simply abandon him after capture. They reached the War Council chamber, where King Aldrin Voss stood over a large holographic map, studying the slow, cautious movement of the unidentified fleet at the edge of Dominion territory. Several generals argued heatedly among themselves, some insisting on an immediate strike before the unknown ships could advance further, others urging caution, wary of provoking a force capable of the devastation described in the old campaign files. "Enough," the king said sharply, silencing the room. He turned toward Serafina as she entered. "You spoke with the prisoner." "I did," she said. "And what did you learn?" Serafina hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I learned that he is not the kind of man who seeks needless destruction," she said. "He had the chance to devastate our forces after his victory at the coalition front, and chose not to. That restraint should tell us something." One of the older generals, a stern woman named Kaylin Draith, scoffed loudly. "Restraint from an enemy commander does not guarantee restraint from an entire fleet arriving to rescue him," she said. "We should strike first, before they gain any further advantage. And risk turning a rescue mission into full-scale war?" Serafina countered, surprising even herself with the confidence in her voice. If his people wanted immediate conflict, they would not be approaching cautiously. They would have already attacked. The king studied his daughter carefully, weighing her words against the tension filling the room. "You believe there is another option beyond conflict," he said slowly. "I believe," Serafina said, "that how we choose to handle this moment will determine whether we end up at war, or whether we finally find a way to end one." The room fell into uneasy silence. Outside the palace walls, the unfamiliar fleet continued its slow, careful approach, waiting patiently for a signal that had not yet come, unaware that the very decision determining peace or all-out war now rested in the hands of a princess who, only days earlier, had known nothing at all about the man she had once mocked so carelessly. Deep below the palace, Marcus Kane sat alone once again, staring at the ceiling of his cell, listening to the faint vibrations traveling through the stone walls, vibrations that told him, more clearly than any words could, that something far larger than his own capture had just begun to move. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a slow, steady breath. The waiting, he knew, was almost over. By the following morning, the palace had transformed into something closer to a war camp than a royal court. Soldiers moved briskly through the corridors, weapons checked and rechecked, communication officers relaying updates on the slow, deliberate approach of the unidentified fleet still gathered at the edge of Dominion space. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension, every conversation hushed, every glance exchanged between officers carrying the weight of an unspoken question. Would this end in peace, or would it end in ruin? King Aldrin Voss called an emergency session of the War Council, and this time, Serafina was not simply permitted to attend. She was expected to. "The fleet has not advanced further in the last 12 hours, Draven reported, standing before the large holographic display showing the slow, patient formation, hovering just beyond Dominion sensors. They are holding position, no hostile action, no communication attempts either." "They're waiting," Serafina said quietly. "Waiting for what?" General Kaylin Draith demanded, her arms crossed tightly. "A formal invitation to invade?" "Waiting to see what we do," Serafina replied evenly. "If they wanted immediate conflict, they would already be attacking. Instead, they're giving us room to make a choice." Her father studied the display for a long moment before turning to the room. "Kane commanded that fleet's forces once before," he said. "If we execute him, or continue holding him without explanation, what response should we expect?" The question hung heavily in the air. Several generals exchanged uneasy glances, none eager to answer with certainty. Finally, Draven spoke. "Based on his tactical history, Your Majesty, I would expect calculated retaliation, not blind aggression. He does not strike out of anger. He strikes when a decision has already been made against him." "Then the decision," Serafina said carefully, "should not be made against him." Kaylin turned toward her sharply. "You would have us release a man responsible for shattering multiple fleets, simply because you spoke with him for a few minutes in a cell?" "I would have us consider," Serafina replied, her voice steady despite the sharpness in the general's tone, "that continuing to treat him as a trophy, rather than a person, is exactly the kind of mistake that started this entire crisis. We captured a soldier without understanding who he truly was. Are we now going to compound that mistake by refusing to understand what comes next? The king studied his daughter for a long, silent moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Finally, he turned toward Draven. "Bring the prisoner to the War Council chamber," he said. "It is time we spoke with him directly, rather than deciding his fate from behind these walls." Minutes later, Marcus Kane was escorted into the chamber, still restrained, though the guards seemed less certain now about how tightly those restraints truly needed to be held. He walked calmly into the room full of generals and nobles who had spent the last several days debating whether to execute him, and he did not flinch beneath the weight of their stares. King Aldrin studied him carefully. "You know why you're here," the king said. "Your fleet outside," Marcus said simply. "Yes. They belong to your people?" "Some of them," Marcus said. "Others are allies who joined the search once word spread that a Dominion patrol had taken a prisoner near Sector 9. "And what do they intend to do?" the king asked. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "That depends entirely on what happens to me in the next few hours," he said. "If I don't send a signal confirming I'm alive and unharmed by sundown, they'll assume the worst, and they'll act accordingly." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Kaylin stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Is that a threat?" "No," Marcus said calmly. "It's simply the truth. I'm not interested in threats. I never have been. I'm interested in avoiding unnecessary conflict, the same as your princess apparently is." Serafina felt the weight of several eyes shift toward her at his words, but she held her composure, meeting her father's gaze directly. "He's telling the truth," she said. "I spoke with him. He had every opportunity to destroy Dominion forces after his victory years ago, and chose restraint instead. That is not the behavior of someone seeking pointless destruction now." The king considered this carefully, his fingers drumming slowly against the table before him. "And if we release you," he said finally, turning back to Marcus, "what guarantee do we have that your fleet won't use this moment as an opportunity to strike regardless?" "None," Marcus said honestly. "Just as you have no guarantee my people won't retaliate if you continue holding me. But I can tell you this. War benefits no one in this room. Not your people, not mine. I've seen enough of it to know that every battle we've fought until now solved nothing except creating more reasons for the next one." Silence stretched through the chamber, heavy and uncertain. Finally, King Aldrin rose slowly from his seat, walking toward the tall window overlooking the capital, the same window his daughter had once found herself staring through during her own restless nights. "For 12 years, he said quietly, this Dominion has told itself a story about strength, about how conquest and dominance were the only paths to security. The disaster at the coalition front was buried, not because it was insignificant, but because it threatened that story." He turned back toward the room, his expression heavy with something that looked almost like exhaustion. "Perhaps it is time we stopped telling ourselves comfortable lies," he said, "and started making decisions based on what actually keeps our people safe." He looked toward Marcus. "I am prepared to release you," he said, "on the condition that you personally negotiate a cessation of hostilities with the fleet currently waiting at our border. If war begins today, soldier, it will not be because Xyrath Prime refused a path toward peace." Marcus studied the king carefully, searching his expression for any trace of deception, finding none. "I can do that," he said, "but I'll need to speak with them directly, and I'll need your daughter to accompany me." The room erupted into immediate protest, several generals rising from their seats in outrage at the suggestion. Kaylin's voice rose above the rest. "Absolutely not! Sending the princess into the hands of an enemy fleet is reckless beyond reason." "They're not simply my enemy's fleet anymore," Marcus said calmly, cutting through the noise. "If we want this to end in genuine peace, rather than a temporary ceasefire built on fear, they need to see more than just my survival. They need to see that Dominion leadership is willing to stand beside me, not simply release me and hide behind their walls." Serafina stepped forward before her father could respond, her decision already made. "I'll go," she said. Her father turned toward her sharply. "Serafina, I helped create this situation," she said firmly, "by refusing to see him as anything more than a trophy when he first arrived. I intend to help resolve it the same way." She looked toward Marcus, something steady and resolute settling into her expression. "If peace is possible, I want to be part of making it happen." The king studied his daughter for a long, tense moment, torn between a father's fear and a ruler's understanding of what true leadership sometimes required. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Then you'll go with a full security escort," he said, "and Marcus Kane will be held personally responsible for your safety." "Understood," Marcus said simply. As the guards moved to release his restraints for the first time since his capture, Marcus rubbed his wrists slowly, glancing toward Serafina with something unreadable in his expression, something that looked almost like quiet respect. "You didn't have to volunteer for this," he said. "Neither did you," she replied, "when you chose restraint over destruction all those years ago." She held his gaze steadily. "Maybe it's time both our people learned something from that choice." Outside the palace walls, the waiting fleet remained motionless at the edge of Dominion space, unaware that the tense standoff threatening to ignite into full-scale war was about to be interrupted by an unlikely alliance between a soldier once mocked as unremarkable and a princess finally willing to see him for exactly who he was. The hour of reckoning had arrived, and neither side fully understood yet just how much was about to change. The shuttle carrying Marcus, Serafina, and a small security escort broke free of Xyrath Prime's atmosphere, its engines humming steadily as it approached the outer edge of Dominion space, where the unfamiliar fleet still waited in careful silence. Serafina sat quietly near the viewport, watching the stars stretch out before them, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the meeting ahead. Beside her, Marcus remained calm, his eyes fixed on the growing shapes of distant ships coming into view. Ships built with a design unlike anything she had studied in Dominion tactical archives. "They look smaller than I expected," she said quietly, breaking the tense silence between them. "They're built for precision, not intimidation," Marcus replied. "Numbers and size never won us anything against the Dominion. Understanding did." As the shuttle drew closer, one of the larger vessels extended a docking corridor, and Marcus rose from his seat, glancing toward Serafina. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," he said, "let me speak first." She nodded, swallowing the nervous tightness in her throat as the shuttle doors opened into the docking bay of the unfamiliar ship. A group of armed soldiers stood waiting, their weapons lowered but ready, their eyes immediately locking onto Marcus with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Commander Kane," one of them said, stepping forward slowly, as though afraid he might be seeing things. "We thought—" "I'm alive," Marcus said simply, "and I need to speak with whoever is currently in command of this fleet." Within minutes, they were escorted through the ship toward a central command deck, where a tall woman with short auburn hair and a commanding presence stood waiting, her expression unreadable, as Marcus entered the room. Her name, Serafina would soon learn, was Commander Elena Marsh, and the resemblance in bearing to her own father was almost unsettling, a mirror image of authority, forged by an entirely different history. "Marcus," Elena said, relief briefly softening her composed expression, before hardening again into professional focus. "We nearly launched a full retrieval strike twice this week. What happened?" "A Dominion patrol found my scout ship near Sector 9, Marcus explained. "I was captured, brought before their royal court, and held until they discovered exactly who I was." He gestured toward Serafina. "This is Princess Serafina Voss, heir to the Dominion throne. She's here to negotiate an end to this standoff before it becomes something neither side can undo." Elena studied Serafina carefully, her expression guarded. "The Voss Dominion has never once sent a member of their royal family to negotiate anything," she said. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to trust." "You have every right to be skeptical," Serafina said, stepping forward despite the tightness in her chest. "My people have spent years building an empire on the belief that strength alone determines who deserves respect. I was raised inside that belief, and I mocked Marcus Kane the moment he was brought before my court, without knowing a single thing about who he truly was, or what restraint he showed your people, all those years ago at the coalition front." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, listening. "I was wrong," Serafina continued, her voice steady, despite the vulnerability in admitting it aloud. "And I believe my father's entire dominion has been wrong, for a very long time, about what true strength actually means. I'm not here because my father ordered me to be. I'm here because I finally understand that peace requires more courage than conquest ever did. The command deck fell into heavy silence, every soldier present watching Elena carefully as she considered the princess's words. Finally, she turned toward Marcus. "You trust her?" "I do," Marcus said simply, no hesitation in his voice. Elena studied Serafina for another long moment, before finally extending a hand, an unfamiliar human gesture that Serafina hesitated over briefly, before accepting, gripping it firmly, despite the foreign nature of the exchange. "Then let's discuss terms," Elena said, "before either side does something we can't take back." Over the following hours, negotiations unfolded carefully across the command deck, each side laying out the fears and grievances that had fueled years of conflict between their people. Serafina found herself surprised by how reasonable many of the human commanders sounded, once given the chance to speak honestly, and in turn, Elena and her officers seemed equally surprised by the princess's willingness to acknowledge the Dominion's past mistakes, rather than defend them blindly. Marcus remained largely quiet throughout most of the discussion, allowing Serafina and Elena to negotiate directly, stepping in only when tensions threatened to rise too quickly, offering calm, measured perspective drawn from years of experience navigating exactly this kind of delicate balance between two proud, wary powers. By the time the negotiations reached their final hours, a tentative framework had begun to take shape, an agreement establishing a full ceasefire, the release of any remaining prisoners held on either side, and the beginning of formal diplomatic talks between human coalition leadership and the Dominion throne, mediated jointly by Marcus and Serafina themselves. As the meeting finally drew to a close, Elena studied the two of them carefully, an unreadable expression crossing her face. "You realize," she said quietly, "that this arrangement will require an extraordinary amount of trust from both sides, trust that hasn't existed between our people in years." "Trust starts somewhere," Marcus said simply. "It might as well start here." Serafina nodded in agreement, though her mind was already racing ahead toward the challenges waiting for her back on Xyrath Prime. Convincing her father's council to formally commit to lasting peace would require far more than a single successful negotiation. It would require dismantling years of ingrained belief that had shaped the entire foundation of Dominion identity. As they prepared to return to the shuttle, Elena pulled Marcus aside briefly, speaking in a low voice meant only for him. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, trusting a Dominion princess with something this fragile. Marcus glanced back toward Serafina, who stood waiting near the shuttle entrance, her posture steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face, after hours of difficult negotiation. "She had every reason to dismiss me the moment she learned who I was," he said quietly. "Instead, she chose to listen, and then she chose to act. That's more than most leaders manage, on either side." Elena studied him for a long moment, before offering a small, tired smile. "Then I suppose we'll find out together whether that trust was well placed." As the shuttle carrying Marcus and Serafina departed the fleet and began its journey back toward Xyrath Prime, Serafina finally allowed herself a slow breath, the tension of the day beginning to ease from her shoulders, for the first time in what felt like weeks. She glanced toward Marcus, who sat quietly beside her, watching the stars pass by the viewport in comfortable silence. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me back there, even after everything I said to you when we first met." Marcus turned toward her, something warm and genuine softening his usually calm, guarded expression. "People can change," he said simply. "You proved that today." She allowed herself a small, tired smile, watching the distant lights of Xyrath Prime grow steadily larger through the viewport ahead. The path toward true peace between their people would not be simple, and she knew countless obstacles still waited for them once they returned. Skeptical council members, wary military leadership, generations of mistrust built on both sides of a long and painful conflict. But for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Serafina felt something she hadn't expected to feel at all. Hope. As their shuttle descended toward the palace, carrying with it the fragile beginnings of an agreement that could reshape the future of two powerful civilizations. Neither Marcus nor Serafina could have known just how deeply that single choice, made in a cold detention cell only days earlier, would go on to change the course of history for both their people. What began as mockery, aimed at a soldier the princess believed to be beneath her notice, had instead become the spark that finally broke the cycle of endless conflict between two mighty realms, proving, in the end, that true strength was never about the size of an empire, or the power behind its throne, but about the courage to recognize a mistake, and the wisdom to change course before it was too late. And as Xyrath Prime's glittering capital rose to meet them beneath a calm, star-filled sky, both Marcus Kane and Princess Seraphina Voss understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together, as the unlikely architects of a peace neither side had ever believed possible. The return to Xyrath Prime was not met with celebration. It was met with fear. Word of the tentative agreement spread quickly through the palace, and by the time Marcus and Seraphina's shuttle touched down in the royal docking bay, a divided court had already gathered to meet them, half hopeful, half furious, and none entirely certain which outcome they were about to witness. General Kaelin Draith stood at the front of the gathered nobles, her arms crossed tightly, her expression sharp with disapproval. "You negotiated directly with enemy leadership," she said the moment Seraphina stepped off the shuttle, "without full council authorization." "I negotiated the beginning of a ceasefire," Seraphina replied evenly, refusing to be shaken by the general's tone. "Before either side made a decision, neither of us could take back. If that requires forgiveness rather than authorization, I'll accept the consequences gladly." King Aldrin stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his expression unreadable as he studied his daughter and the soldier standing calmly beside her. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. Inside the War Council chamber, Seraphina and Marcus laid out the full details of the agreement reached aboard the human fleet, the ceasefire terms, the framework for prisoner releases, the proposal for ongoing diplomatic talks mediated jointly between both sides. The room listened in tense silence, some nobles exchanging skeptical glances, others leaning forward with cautious curiosity, as the possibility of an actual resolution began to take shape before them. "This is not a full peace treaty," Marcus clarified honestly. "It's a foundation. Genuine trust between our people will take time to build, likely years, possibly longer, but every lasting peace has to start with a single decision to stop the fighting long enough to actually listen to one another." Kaelin remained unconvinced, her voice sharp as she addressed the room. "And what happens the moment this fragile peace breaks down? What happens when old grievances resurface, as they always do?" "Then we address them the same way we addressed this crisis," Seraphina said firmly. "Through honest conversation, instead of assumptions built on mockery and fear. I made that exact mistake myself the day Marcus Kane was first brought before this court, and it very nearly cost all of us dearly. I don't intend to repeat it." The king studied the room carefully, weighing the mixture of hope and hesitation reflected in the expressions of his council. Finally he rose from his seat, his voice carrying steady authority across the chamber. "For too long," he said, "this dominion has mistaken silence for strength, and conquest for security. My daughter has shown more courage in the last few days than this council has shown in the last 12 years combined, choosing honesty over comfortable illusions, even when it meant admitting fault in front of the very soldier she once mocked." He turned toward Marcus. "You had every reason to see us as nothing more than an enemy deserving destruction," he said. "Instead, you chose patience, and now, cautious partnership. That restraint deserves to be met with equal effort from this throne." He faced the council fully. "Effective immediately, the Dominion will honor the ceasefire negotiated by my daughter and Commander Kane. Formal diplomatic talks will begin within the month, mediated jointly, as proposed. Any officer who cannot commit to this path is free to voice their objection now, openly, rather than through quiet resistance later." The chamber remained silent, and though several council members still wore expressions of clear unease, no one dared openly challenge the king's decision. Slowly, one by one, the assembled nobles offered their reluctant agreement, some out of genuine hope, others simply recognizing that continued conflict offered no better alternative. In the weeks that followed, the fragile peace began, slowly and carefully, to take root. Diplomatic envoys from the human coalition arrived at Xyrath Prime, under careful escort, met initially with wary distance from Dominion citizens, still unaccustomed to seeing humans as anything other than enemies. Marcus remained at the palace throughout this period, serving as a steady bridge between both sides, his calm presence easing tension whenever negotiations grew tense, his history lending credibility to promises that might otherwise have been dismissed as empty words. Serafina worked tirelessly alongside him, meeting personally with skeptical nobles, addressing concerns from frightened citizens, slowly reshaping the narrative her people had clung to for generations, the belief that strength only existed through conquest and dominance. It was not easy work. Old wounds ran deep on both sides, and progress often felt painfully slow, met with setbacks and moments of renewed distrust that threatened to unravel everything they had worked to build. Yet through it all, Marcus and Serafina remained steady partners, their early animosity long since replaced by a quiet, growing respect that neither had expected when their story began, in a cold detention cell beneath the palace. Late one evening, several months into the ongoing negotiations, Serafina found herself standing beside Marcus on a high balcony overlooking the glittering capital city, the same city that had once mocked him as an unremarkable prisoner, now slowly learning to see him as something closer to an unlikely hero. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended?" she asked quietly, watching the lights flicker across the distant towers below. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Every day," he admitted. "One wrong decision, one moment of fear instead of patience, and we'd likely still be at war right now. Both our people losing far more than either could afford." "I almost made that mistake," Serafina said softly. "I judged you the moment you were brought before my court, based on nothing but assumptions I never bothered to question. But you didn't stop there," Marcus said, turning toward her. "You chose to learn the truth instead, even when it meant admitting you were wrong in front of everyone who mattered. That took more courage than most rulers ever show." Serafina held his gaze, something warm and steady passing quietly between them. "I suppose we make a strange pair," she said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the exhaustion of the past several months. "A soldier my people once feared, and a princess who mocked him the moment she met him." "Strange beginnings sometimes lead to the best outcomes," Marcus replied, a rare, easy smile of his own crossing his face. As the months continued to pass, the fragile ceasefire slowly matured into something far stronger, a genuine, lasting peace, built not on forced submission or overwhelming conquest, but on mutual respect and hard-earned understanding between two civilizations who had once seen each other only as enemies. Trade routes reopened cautiously between human and Dominion territories. Joint councils formed to address lingering disputes through diplomacy rather than warfare. Slowly, painstakingly, an era defined by endless conflict began, for the first time in generations, to give way to the quiet, steady work of genuine cooperation. Marcus eventually returned to serve as a permanent liaison between human coalition leadership and the Dominion throne, his presence a constant living reminder of how easily fear and assumption could nearly destroy the possibility of peace, and how powerfully patience and honesty could rebuild it instead. Serafina, in turn, grew into a leader unlike any Dominion ruler before her, one who valued understanding over dominance and humility over unchecked pride. Years later, when historians on both sides of the once bitter conflict looked back on the moment everything began to change, they did not point to grand battles or sweeping military strategy. They pointed instead to a single quiet exchange in a cold detention cell, where a princess who had mocked a soldier she believed beneath her notice finally chose to sit down, listen, and truly see the man in front of her for exactly who he was. It was not brute strength that had broken the cycle of endless war between two mighty realms. It was the simple, difficult choice to admit a mistake, and the quiet courage it took to build something better in its place. And somewhere in the heart of a capital that once mocked him as small and unremarkable, Marcus Kane stood now not as a prisoner, nor as a conquering enemy, but as living proof that even the mightiest realms could be reshaped, not through fear, but through the patient, unshakable strength of a single honest choice, made at exactly the right moment.